The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, formerly of this parish, said, "When my information changes, I alter my conclusions. What do you do, sir?" Given that, 1, travel for Cambridgeshire surveys show that the average length for cycle commutes is nearly 6 kilometres. 2, the 2011 census states that 10% of commuting trips in South Cambridgeshire are by bicycle, with 2,400 over 5 kilometres and 6,500 more than 10 kilometres. 3, cycle trips across the boundary from South Cambridgeshire to the city have increased 89% in the last 9 years, whereas the numbers of car trips are relatively stable. 4, over half the benefits of the new cycle schemes under the Cycle Ambition grants are from improved health, and that clearly has a big economic benefits. 5, 36% of households in the lowest quintile income groups in East Anglia have no access to a car or van. And 6, on March the 2nd, the ODPM, Nick Clegg, press release cites research showing that if we had levels of cycling similar to Denmark, it could save the NHS 17 billion within 20 years, reduce road deaths by 30%, and increase the mobility of the nation's poorest families by 25%, and increase the retail sales by a quarter. I asked, what can the Assembly and the public in general do to ensure the board is better aware of this and similar information?
Thanks very much, Mr. Chisholm. I'm proposing, because I know that the following 2 public statements are on similar subjects, I'm proposing to leave that question of yours on the table. I think the answer to it will probably be in the field of bearing that in mind when we come to consider our future work programme and schedule of meetings. But thank you for the moment anyway. And then come to the second public question, which is from Mr. Gareth Bevans. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. In making the cost-benefit analysis to the Greater Cambridge area of longer distance foot and cycle paths south of the city, could the Assembly include into their consideration the legacy, financial and social impact of the following? The social and health benefits of providing safe access to the countryside for city dwellers, as well as those living along these corridors. The enhanced social well-being created by enabling and encouraging families and friends of all ages who are dispersed along these corridors to affordably, safely and routinely use these paths to interact with each other. The opportunity cost of inactivity on individuals, personal health and associated savings to health services should road users be given a walking cycling alternative. The economic and strategic benefits of completing the links between research parks south of the city at Hinxton, Little Chesterford, Great Abington, Babraham and Addenbrooks, and also of linking those to the residential areas south of the city. Increased tourism opportunities for tourists to extend their stay in Cambridge and explore and experience the surrounding countryside, towns, villages and attractions. Present and future road congestion, particularly given the housing planned for Uttlesford and settlements south of Cambridge. The payback period achieved on the road maintenance budget of road users who have switched transport modes to cycling and walking. The Uttlesford path cost is £1.1 million. It is broken down into modular parts, one of which has already received Section 106 funding. From the Cambridge side, all that is needed is around 3/4 of a mile between Great Chesterford railway station and Ickleton. From that point, we will have a plan to link all of these things together with the paths in Cambridgeshire. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bevans, for your statement. I think that that is something that members may wish to draw on when we talk under item 7C on the agenda in relation to the transport. The third public contribution is from County Councillor Susan van der Ven, who's a member of the County Council but not a member of the Assembly. Could we have your contribution, Susan?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Yes, as a county councillor, I represent Melbourne, Foxton, Shepworth and Meldreth, a large chunk of the Cambridge to Royston corridor, and part of an intensely interconnected cluster of employment centres and residential areas. Royston is across the county border, but is part of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough LEP. It is also integral to the sub-bubble of the greater Cambridge phenomenon that exists along the A10, both on account of its house building plans and also its industrial park and multiple employment opportunities. I also chair the A10 Corridor Cycling Campaign. Our members live between Royston and Cambridge and work at places like Melbourne Science Park, Johnson Matthey in Royston, and the Cambridge Biomedical Campus. The cycling campaign has presented you with a letter, which I hope you have before you. It's a letter of support now signed by 66 employment centres in the A10 corridor. It emphasises the high value placed on the prospect of a safe cycling network along the A10 as a means of travelling to work. Distances are modest and achievable, even for someone like me. Business car park spaces are running out, and congestion renders peak time car journeys unreliable. One high-tech company says that its recruitment profile is someone who is young and fit, will work long hours, and expect to be able to cycle safely to work as a means of getting good daily exercise. Another business says that its apprentices are now cycling to work in dangerous conditions because it is their only affordable mode of transport. A correction to the letter has been suggested by AstraZeneca and Johnson Matthey, who both point out that they employ not many hundreds of people, but many thousands. The city deal is built around the principle of unlocking further funding, and so the announcement this week of Cycling Ambition Grant funding is a case in point. Subject to committee agreement next week, this will help fund a cycle route between Cambridge and Foxton. The unfunded half of the Cambridge-Royston cycle link is the southern half from Foxton Level Crossing south to Royston. This is a highly deliverable segment of the overall scheme, with land ownership issues sorted out, path design completed, and local consultation on details already carried out. The A10 campaign has facilitated regular interaction with council colleagues in Hertfordshire, and we've also been talking to our LEPs. While it was disappointing that none of the rural cycle schemes were included in the Executive Board's Tranche 1 funding list, the job now is to find ways of supporting their progression and realisation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. Again, that is a contribution that I think members may want to refer to when we come to the item 7C on the transport programme. So I propose to move on right now, but return to those points later. The next stages of the Greater Cambridge City Deal Transport Programme and City Centre Congestion. This is a report from Graham Hughes, who's going to speak to. The subject divides effectively into two parts. One which is the part that relates to the specific planning for next phases of the transport programme, and the other which deals with the means of addressing consensus forming, direction setting in relation to measures for city centre congestion. So, Graham, could you do the presentation for the first part, and then we'll pause for a discussion.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I can certainly do that. Just briefly, the background to this paper is that certainly to the first half of this paper is that the Executive Board on the 28th of January decided on the priorities for phase 1 of the City Deal, so that's the first 5 years. But equally, as part of that process, the Executive Board decided to allocate quite a significant amount of funding within that first 5-year period to develop what was referred to as a pipeline of schemes. So they're the schemes that will come on beyond 2020. And so there is a significant amount of money available to identify what happens in later stages of the City Deal. We think as officers that is particularly important, because what we want to avoid is clearly having a break after the 5-year period, when you have a frantic period of activity delivering things, then you have a break while you develop the next section of schemes, and then you move on. So we're looking at a continuous delivery of schemes once we get going over the whole of the City Deal period. So the first half of this paper outlines how we would, as officers, propose to do that. And as with the previous papers so far on this agenda, this is a paper to the board on which comments from this assembly are being sought. So the tranche 2 of the City Deal funding kicks in from 2020-21 onwards. That 5-year package is £40 million a year. That's £200 million over the total 5-year period. So what we would propose to do, in very simple terms, is to seek fairly shortly, actually, to prioritise the schemes that are left over from the initial prioritisation exercise that was undertaken through the Assembly and decided on by the board. So you'll recall when you had your meeting earlier this year, you had a complete list of schemes which totals about £750 or so million. £180 million roughly of schemes and activity has been taken out of that list for prioritisation under phase 1. So what we would propose to do is to look at everything that's left and put that back through the model that we had produced for us by Cambridge Econometrics and SQW to identify the prioritised list from that sort of residual set of schemes, which is still in excess of £500 million in total. So that's the process we would propose to use. Clearly, if any new information has come forward between when the original exercise was undertaken and when this new exercise is undertaken, we would feed that in. And that sort of information could, for example, be any outputs emerging from the local plan inquiries into the Cambridge City and South Cambs district local plans, or indeed it could be, for example, extra funding that's come in to fund schemes that otherwise were in that list. So we would propose to use the same prioritisation tool, and what we're suggesting is that we would aim to be able to do that work and report back through this Assembly and onto the board during the latter part of this year, so sort of from the autumn onwards. We would undertake the work spring into summer and then report in the autumn to the Assembly and board. In terms of actually delivering those schemes, or in fact developing those schemes, what we would propose to do then is to pause and not undertake the detailed development work on the prioritised schemes, probably until about mid-2017 onwards. The reason why we suggest that is that there is a huge amount of work, both officer and consultant work, that's required to prepare schemes in phase 1 of the deal for delivery, which is likely to commence probably from 2017 onwards. And so rather than create an enormous peak of work up front, we would rather spread our resources. So once we've done that development work in phase 1, we can then use that resource to move on to developing the phase 2 schemes. If we commence, we think, in mid-2017 onwards, that still gives plenty of time to have those schemes in phase 2 developed and ready to be delivered as soon as we have confirmation that the funding is available. So that's the broad process that we're proposing, Chairman.
Thank you. So questions to Graham on that? Helen?
We've had a couple of papers from, is it Rail Futures Cambridge Metro, which essentially, I guess, put forward a proposition that some of the phase 2 proposals are unnecessary duplication. I just wondered whether we might want to feed that in and perhaps invite them to come and talk to us at one of our meetings before we kind of make too much further progress on phase 2.
If I can just take that, I mean, I think that the idea of us informing ourselves about the relationship of our programme with rail improvements is quite a good one. With a couple of other members, I met the people who written to us all a few days ago, and I think it would be useful if we could find the right way of having an informed discussion focused on the relationship of all of our known stuff in the City Deal with rail, whether there is an interplay, whether there should be an interplay. So I think it's one of those things that I think goes in our future programme possibilities for an agenda item to go after that. Any other questions to Graham? Martin.
So I think it's a good point on rail, and there are other things as well that have been talked about in the past that we could address in this committee. And I'm thinking in terms of kind of blue sky thinking, I guess, what might happen in this city in the future, because we've got this list of things that we're going to do that have been hanging over for years, and some of those still haven't got on the list, and we're talking about adding some more on a new list. But then also looking forward, I guess there are possibilities for the city that, I don't want to mention any individual items now, but that we could talk about, or have people come to talk to us about, that we might consider for the next 5 years or 10 or 15, that might improve the mobility of people in the city and the region.
If I can again answer that,
sorry, there was a question.
totally agree with you, and I think
Yeah,
the same
okay.
sort of answer to the one I just gave. Yeah, absolutely. Bridget.
Thank you. It wasn't what I was going to say, but just following on what Martin said, it would be good if we had a sort of programme of proper public engagement, because the public have got to have a role in helping identify projects that we haven't currently identified. So anyway, actually what I wanted to pick up on was the presentations we had at the beginning of the meeting. Is this the right time to do it?
I think this is the only time.
Right, okay, that's fine. All right. You know that I did write to you about my concerns in relation to the rural cycle schemes, and I've done quite a lot of thinking about this and research since the last meeting, and we've had these very interesting presentations this morning. So I would like to propose that we add a third recommendation to the two that are on the papers, and I've got copies of what I was going to propose. Which I'll read out, but I'll just give you a sort of bit of background. What I want to suggest is that we re-establish the reserve list which we got rid of last time. The reason being that I think it gives a sort of safety net to the whole process. If, let's say, some of these big feasibility studies, which are we're getting going now, show that projects can't be completed within the 5-year time frame, I think that by having a reserve list which has some easy wins, some affordable, easily deliverable projects in it, allows those projects to be pulled up quickly in order not to jeopardise any of our trigger points. So what I've said is the Assembly welcomes the success of the County Council's bid to the Cycling City Ambition Fund, which was just announced this week, and notes that it should enable parts of the rural cycling projects considered at our last meeting to proceed independent of the city deal. It recommends to the board that the originally tabled cycling infrastructure schemes, or parts of them that are not funded from the Cycling City Ambition Fund or any other external source, should be treated as reserve projects within tranche 1 of the City Deal programme. And this is the important bit. Due to the acknowledged high risk of many of the bigger prioritised schemes, the cycling projects' attractive value for money in terms of enabling economic growth, their deliverability and spade-ready status, and the role they can play in connecting people with jobs within the specific demographics of the Cambridge Technology Cluster. So I hope that won't be too controversial. It's not forcing anybody to do anything they don't want. It's not forcing the executive board to go back on the decisions they've made. What I hope is that this is a positive way of providing a safety net if we suddenly found at year 4 that actually one of the big schemes wasn't going to be deliverable. It just gives us something that we can pull up, and I think Councillor van der Ven pointed out the spade-ready nature of some of these projects. The City Deal's funding was all about unlocking match funding. We got $500 million, but the whole scheme is for $1 billion plus. So the result should be joint funding, and I think the Chisholm Trail has got 3 funders sort of feeding into it. So I think it's quite right that the City Deal is part of that. So I hope you will be able to look on this as a positive way of delivering the cycling, which I think we know there's a lot of sort of public enthusiasm for, but the letter with so many signatories and local businesses does show that there is an appetite within the economic sector for this, that they see it as a way of attracting the demographic of employee they want, one of the very good points was that people working extraordinarily long days, haven't got time at the beginning or end of the day to go to the gym. So, if they can pedal furiously 6 miles to get to work, that's kind of ticks the exercise box for them. So anyway, it is what it is, and I do hope that you feel happy about adding that to the recommendations.
Comments, reactions on that? No?
Yeah, I actually fully endorse this recommendation.
Thank you.
Because I think we know what can happen as time goes on. Certain projects that we might have in mind could fall into jeopardy. It's wonderful that we had the announcement earlier this week for the £6 million from central government for schemes within the city and South Cambridgeshire. And the cycle project team of officers are actually holding a stakeholders meeting to actually identify new schemes beyond the large ones like the Chisholm Trail and so on. So I think this is a very timely amendment here, an addition, because as was just stated, cycling is at the centre of Cambridge, South Cambridgeshire, and the rest of Cambridgeshire as well. There is a great appetite for people to be able to get out on bikes and cycle safely, not only to work, but as was mentioned earlier on by the speaker, people want to get out in the countryside and actually for leisure purposes and also to improve their health. So I fully endorse this. It was a bit disappointing that list had been reduced, but we understand the reasons for that, and I think it's quite good to bring this back in and highlight the great need for cycleways.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Chair. The reason why the list was reduced, I think the comment was made that there's always funding for cycling coming from government, and it is so pleasing to see that this money and funding did come forward. And in actual fact, it's no coincidence that the Cycling City Ambition Funds were given to those cities that are going through the city deal process at the moment. Can I have a quick question to officers to ask, and then maybe a supplementary afterwards, Chair? Just with this funding that's come forward, how many of the projects that were in the original list will be funded by that money, and how much is left? I'm just talking about the original list at the moment.
I was going to suggest that I ask Graham to respond next as well, so do you want to respond so far?
Thank you, Chairman. Through you, just picking up that final question. So the latest allocation through Cycle City Ambition Grant is around about 6 million. The final decision on the schemes to be funded from that allocation is still to be made, because the process for identifying this round of bidding, us submitting our bid and the government making its decision has been unbelievably short, literally a matter of weeks. And so there hasn't actually been enough time to run through the normal decision-making process in terms of identifying what went in the bid. So literally there was a couple of weeks between when the need was identified, or a few weeks, and the bid having to go in. So the final decision by members on which schemes will be funded is still to come, and that decision is programmed for one of the county council committees coming up. But on the basis that if what went into the bid is what comes out in terms of funding, the key scheme in that bid that related to the city deal was the A10 cycling improvements, and so that would then complete the route pretty much down to Meldreth, which is not the absolute entirety of the A10 route, but it's by far the most expensive part of the route. And so a significant part of that corridor that would certainly link up, as various members around the table have said, link up with the key employment locations, that will be covered. There is then still a significant amount of funding left in the Cycling City Ambition Grant allocation, and there are suggested schemes that can come forward, but that is the principal one from the city deal perspective. Could I just touch on, Chairman, just a couple of the other points, just briefly. I think, if I understood Councillor Smith's comments, it was about adding in or adding back in the cycle schemes. if you like, as a cushion, should some of the other schemes, as a reserve, should some of the other schemes not go ahead. I think I'll probably say a couple of things about that. One is, as I've just mentioned, the Cycle City Ambition Grant allocation has been made, and so that already takes one of those schemes out of the process. And in reality, as I said to a number of members when the board made their decision, in reality, not funding through City Deal and using alternative funding sources may well actually be a much quicker way of delivering some of these schemes, because the funding is it's short term, it has to be spent, and you can just get on straight away. And it's not competing, if you like, with a range of other schemes for resource. Second thing I'd say is that there is £180 million in that currently allocated package. Now, we over-allocated, bearing in mind there's only £100 million of government money coming. We over-allocated for two reasons. One is because we do expect, and the City Deal is predicated on the basis that there will be additional funding coming in on top of the £500 million of government money. So that could be Section 106, Community Infrastructure Levy, money from the LEP, or other sources. So we expect to deliver more than 100 million in the first 5 years. On the other hand, there may be one or two schemes that just flip over into phase 2 of the deal or just become undeliverable. But my point really is that I think there are probably more than enough schemes that we've so far allocated to actually utilise all of the funding that's identified for the first 5 years. In terms of a specific recommendation, and you've circulated the paper, I think it's entirely for this assembly to make whatever views known to the executive board that wishes. I don't think it's appropriate for this assembly to change the paper before you, because that is an executive board paper. But in your reporting back, as the chair will do to the executive board, you wish to put something forward as an additional recommendation. I think that's entirely within your gift, and then the board will consider how to deal with that. So subject to you, Chair, if that's what this committee wishes, then that is reasonable, but I suggest we don't change the paper.
Yes, so what I had understood this was from Councillor Smith was an add to the suggested recommendations. Sorry. What I understood was that this proposal from Councillor Smith was an add on to the recommendations, not what's in place of anything that is in the report.
And can I suggest, Chairman, I think the better way to deal with that is for this assembly to report to the executive board about things it wishes to be added, because otherwise we will end up with, if you like, mixed messages about who is saying what. Officers have made recommendations to the board based upon, if you like, the process that was undertaken at the end of January. This assembly is scrutinising that paper that is going to the board. So if this assembly wishes to add a recommendation, which, as I say, is entirely within your gift, I think the most appropriate way for you to do that is to, in Chairman, your report to the board, put it forward explicitly as an additional recommendation for the board to consider.
That's how I read it, if that's the will of the Assembly, which we haven't really established yet. So, Roger, yes, just come back.
Thank you, Chairman. And just before I have to duck, I am in support of cycleways. Just looking to my left over there. But it's also my understanding that because we have the funding through the Cycling City Ambition Fund, that actually these shovel-ready schemes will actually be delivered quicker than if they were actually part of the City Deal and having to go through the City Deal process. So that's one point. Secondly, it worries me that if we actually publicly say, we want the city, the cycling scheme to be included in the City Deal, that might take away from any future bids that we have. Now, government is being very specific, I think, and targeted cycling schemes, and we're one of the main beneficiaries of it. And I think we should just let the status quo carry on. If we have to change tack in the future, then so be it. But I think we're doing extremely well at the moment, and the way things are, delivering it probably better than if it went through the City Deal, or they went through the City Deal. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to be blown up. This thing's sparking.
No.
Right. Just to reiterate, this assembly, we've already stated, is the sort of conduit for communications from the public. And, the public are speaking in relation to this issue. So, it is right that we listen to them. I think we need to appreciate that in order to really drive modal shifts, these projects need to be complete if they're in little sections, little 2 or 3 mile sections, that will not drive the full opportunities for modal ships. So the fact that it is not unlikely that some of these cycling schemes will attract funding from elsewhere, I don't think is a good reason not to include them in a reserve list, because what we're doing is providing some assurance that they will be delivered in the near future. All right, if more funding comes through, then that's fantastic, and we take them out of the reserve list because they've been funded elsewhere. But what we're doing is just giving a safety buffer which will allow their delivery in their entirety, using City Deal money should no other money come forward. So I reiterate, please will you give serious consideration about making this recommendation to the board, which I think is quite a soft way of listening to what people are saying, listening most importantly to businesses who are giving us a very clear message here about what the economic benefits to them are. And also, we've had a very interesting presentation from Claire about making the Greater Cambridgeshire area attractive to inward investment, and this will all add to the offer that she can make to potential investors.
Thank you very much. So this is a proposition would go, if it was supported, as well as the recommendations that we haven't yet discussed yet. I propose just to leave this on one side whilst we talk about the other recommendations. We come back and vote on everything together, if that's okay. So just to return to the main thread, which Graham already spoke to, I had one question, which was I didn't quite get a clear understanding from what you said, Graham, at the beginning about the relationships of the relationship between schemes that are sort of ploughed back into the second phase, schemes that we've already seen talked about at our last meeting, and new schemes that come along as a result of the way thinking develops. So I just think it needs to be clear whether the schemes that we've already heard of that haven't yet been prioritised are preempting other schemes that we haven't thought about yet in the second tranche, or whether it's a more free-flowing process than that, and that we will be able to envisage sort of displacing some things even that we anticipate we would like to go forward right now.
Thank you, Chairman. The proposal is that if we do the prioritisation work over let's say the summer of this year, we can only deal with what we have. And so if by that stage all we have are the schemes that originally were considered as part of that prioritisation process, and that is what we look at. If along the way additional schemes are developed and are agreed as ones which should be considered further by this Assembly then through to the Executive Board, then clearly we can add that into the process. But at the time that we will do the prioritisation, it will be based upon what we know. At the moment, the only things that I know are the schemes that were considered as part of the overall package. But of course, that may change over time. I think we were very clear when we first presented to the Assembly that the whole essence of the programme is it needs to be a dynamic programme, and we need something to fix on at the point that we made that first prioritisation. But clearly things, not least of all as a result of the local plan process, may well change. Could I just, sorry, Chairman, could I just make one further clarification? It's maybe me just being a little bit slow on these issues, but just to be absolutely clear in relation to the point we just discussed from Councillor Smith, my suggestion was that the paper that goes to the board is as presented to you today, and that therefore the paper is not changed, but that in your report back to the Executive Board you would be recommending an additional recommendation. I don't think it's within the gift of the Assembly to change the paper that's going to the Executive Board, but it is within your gift to make suggestions through your report.
It's fine.
I think that's understood by me anyway.
Yeah.
And,
No problem.
yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions on the first part of this? Is on the first part going?
I'm looking at addressing congestion issues in Cambridge.
No, that's the second part. We'll just come to that. So, okay, let's get Graham. Andy on the first part.
Yeah, it was. I got distracted by cycling for a moment. So one of the things, actually, it links a little bit to the cycling, is when we looked at those first schemes, we had to do it quite quickly, so we didn't really understand what other potential funding mechanisms might come in for other schemes. So when we come to the second wave of prioritisation, it's very useful to have some sort of flavour of where other money might come from, what other schemes are being considered outside of the city deal.
Right. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, we can certainly do that, Andy. I mean, I think we are in a slightly odd season at the moment, if you like, in that there's all sorts of bits of funding that keep popping out at very short notice, and Cycle City Ambition Grant, I think, came into that category. So it's not always possible to say what is coming up. What we can do is to say to you the sort of regular sources of funding, and I think a couple of members have mentioned that to you already, that it would be helpful to know what the opportunities are. There are regular sources of funding like Section 106, Community Infrastructure Levy, LEP and so on, that we know where it's going. There will always be sudden pots of money the government finds that we have to bid into that we can't predict, and so there's always a bit more, but we'll we can certainly tell you what we can tell you.
Yeah, I was just going to use the example. Remember the Vauxhall Crossing, we sort of crossed off, as it were, because we knew there was funding elsewhere. It's just making sure we try and capture in our table where we know the known knowns rather than the unknown unknowns.
Great. Graham, would you like to go right on talking to the second part of this?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, and I will be brief on this section. Members actually in questions for the previous section already sort of strayed into some of the elements here. So essentially, we all know that congestion actually over the whole of the Greater Cambridge area is difficult at times, but it's particularly difficult within Cambridge City. And you heard Andy Campbell at the start of this meeting saying how particularly bad it was towards the Christmas period. So members will recall that when the Executive Board took its decision on the prioritised programme for Phase 1, they allocated £22.6 million for what was referred to as city centre capacity. And so this is at the moment, not clearly defined package. So it's a lump of money that is essentially attached to trying to do something, quite possibly more radical measures than the sort of regular schemes that we're looking at for the rest of the city deal area within Cambridge City, to try and address some of those really difficult and pressing congestion problems. What I say in the paper is that a lot of attention over the last, and Andy Campbell referred to this, the last 10 15 years has been on the most central part of Cambridge. So through the core traffic scheme with the bollards and so on, we've sort of, to a large extent, removed most of the traffic and freed things up within the inner ring road, but it's actually outside of the inner ring road, and in fact on the ring road itself, and these are the points that Andy Campbell was making, that there are particular issues as the traffic has been pushed out onto that set of roads, and there is less and less capacity and more traffic. So that's why we're seeing really, really extensive levels of congestion. So what, as officers, what we're proposing is that there's a need, we think, to get on quickly, and we believe that the board, and I'm hoping the Assembly think there's a need to get on quickly and identify what can be done so we can actually develop the details. So in the paper before you, at paragraph 17, we've chosen not to give you examples of specific schemes because that I think is a bit too early, but what we've given you are 4 kind of themes that schemes of a slightly more radical nature, if I can put it in those terms, could fall into. So further restrictions on movement, demand management, which is, could be a subset of that, capacity enhancement and behavioural measures. In reality, I think we believe that a package for the city centre would probably encompass all of those things, but we need to get there and see what the schemes could be. So what we're suggesting is, subject to the views of the Assembly today and then the Executive Board at the end of this month, is we're suggesting that officers should go away, should do a little bit more work, not a lot of detailed work, but some work around those themes to just give examples of the types of schemes that could come forward within Cambridge City under each of those broad headings, those 4 broad headings. The suggestion is that over the summer, ideally, this is a tight programme, but over the summer we would look to have some public and stakeholder engagement around those themes, just to gauge, if you like, appetite for those sorts of measures. And then from the autumn onwards, subject to reporting back through the Assembly and the Board, we would actually develop some of those proposals so we could then firm up specific schemes to be funded with this 22 million or so £million. So that's the proposal. Consultation over the summer, further details developed latter part of this year, and then moving on to delivery thereafter.
Could I just ask you to clarify a little bit, Graham? You're saying that you would bring back those sort of 4 buckets of themes to talk to the Assembly and then the Board about. And you would do that when?
Subject to, because this again, as I said at the start of the paper, draft paper to the board, so subject to your recommendation here and decision from the board, we would want to go away quickly and develop the thinking. The next cycle of these meetings takes us into June for the executive board, so we'd be able to get something back into that meeting. But by definition, it's going to have to be very high level because that doesn't give us a long time. But I think we would be looking simply to put a little bit of flesh onto the bones of these four themes. So to pick an example, within the Cambridge City and South Cambridgeshire transport strategy, one of the sort of measures that we're proposing could be considered is extension of the controlled parking zone. Now, I'm not suggesting that's right or wrong, but I'm just saying that that is a measure that would come under the demand management heading. So we would put a little bit of thinking around that and other measures that could fit under each of these themes for consideration, and then, as I say, assessment of what the public and stakeholder appetite is for each of those.
Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just on the city centre, the highways infrastructure in the city centre has often been repaired at enormous expense, only to break up again without months. And you only have to, anybody that cycles down Sydney Street will know that Sydney Street is a good example of that type of road surface that is not suitable for very large heavy vehicles, yet gets several large heavy vehicles on it. We need to think about how to manage that and what we do in terms of, let's not replace like for instance Sydney Street bricks on their side, it seems to me, and we then repair little sections only for another section to sink, to make cycling a bit of a nightmare along there. But there are some other sort of reasonably quick and effective things we can do, like including yellow box junctions to stop people pulling and holding up traffic because they've gone across into the middle of the road because they thought it was their turn and they can't get anywhere, and nobody else can move. And maybe something technological, and this was suggested to me, so it's not mine, but a smart app to warn people about major delays in the city. And I'm sure somewhere like Cambridge, that's not beyond us to come up with something like that. And maybe to get some more data analysis on the worst peak time congestion and peak time destinations. So we all know what we're looking at.
Thanks very much. Although that's a great line of thinking and debate, I suspect that that's what we're going to be doing when we get to June. So, because I'm sure there will be lots of contributions like Kevin's, and probably the best way of handling that, Graham, would be that we say that if members around the table have dimensions of this that they want to make sure get some attention on what you come back with, they should contact you directly, I think, because this is not the meeting where we start evaluating and talking about the specifics, it's about the process. But Kevin got in ahead of the queue.
Got in there first, Chair. Thank you very much.
So are there any other points? The proposition is that we would have a meeting probably at our meeting in June where we would hear about these themes and able to comment on that, and then afterwards there would be some, after the board has done the same thing, there would be some sort of public engagement on this. But my comment about that was, because these are very, can be very controversial subjects, we will feel very strongly about them. Warning signals go to me when we talk about undertaking public engagement in the summer, because my experience is that people will come back afterwards and it's finished and say that was while they were on their holidays. I just wonder, is there some scope in the programme here to make sure that we time that part of what you're proposing so that it doesn't collide with the traditional period when people are out of town?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I mean, good point. I mean, we would always avoid doing something over the 4 or 5 or 6 weeks of school holidays only. I mean, it's quite possible to do a consultation or engagement exercise that spans that and more, so at least there's opportunity for people to, and that's certainly what we would seek to do. So we would definitely avoid what you suggested.
Martin?
Just one small detailed point on C of item 17, capacity enhancement, what bus priorities. So could that also include capacity enhancement for cycling in the city? Because it seems to me that we are the city in the UK where the most cycling happens. We are number 1 by a long way. So we already have people cycling all over the place around the city. And to enable people to use the city more efficiently, for example, on East Road going towards the Catholic Church, to not, I know, but to not have a cycle lane, to not have a cycle lane. We're talking about bus lanes here.
Can we put that on the list, Graham, and come back to that in June? Thanks, Martin. Roger, quickly.
Yes, quickly, Chairman. With regards to consultation, I really believe we can consult over the summer. We just have to, I think, as been mentioned, just make the actual consultation period a bit longer. Otherwise, we seem to shut down for 2 months over summer, and I, as much as I'd love to go away for summer for 6 weeks, I and many people that I know actually don't. So I don't see it should be a barrier.
No. Thank you very much. I'm going to suggest that we take the recommendations now that we've got here. We've got A and B and the add-on to that, which is from Councillor Smith. Let's take A and B first. Could I see those in favour of those recommendations? Okay, thank you very much. And those against? And the proposition from Councillor Smith, which was circulated, those in favour? And those against?